for listening to the Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
The topic of IVF, or in vitro fertilization, has been in the news lately, including 2 articles in the Lutheran Witness. And so today we're going to talk about questions associated with IVF with experts in medicine and theology. Today's episode of the Coffee Hour is underwritten in part by Concordia University Irvine. You can learn more about Concordia University Irvine at cui.edu. Joining us today, Dr. Donna Harrison, Director of Research with the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. Dr. Harrison, welcome back to the Coffee Hour.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Glad to be here.
And the Reverend Dr. Scott Stiegemeyer, Associate Professor of Theology and Bioethics at Concordia University Irvine. Dr. Stiegemeyer, welcome back to the Coffee Hour.
Thank you. It's always good to talk to you guys.
Now, IVF is, it's been in the news lately. It can be a tricky subject to talk about, and I'm glad we're having this conversation today. It's come up many times in my circles in the last few weeks. So first, Dr. Harrison, let's talk about why IVF has been in the news recently.
Well, I think it might be because of the administration's willingness to consider increasing support for IVF and increasing support for infertile couples. I think that's probably why.
Dr. Stiegemeyer, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, just that, this is an ongoing issue. And as technologies continue to improve and more things are being offered to people, infertility is, for many, a very painful experience. And so I don't know. I think Dr. Harrison nailed it as to why it's more in the news or more on people's attention today. But it is also just kind of an ongoing thing. And many Christians struggle with knowing how to go about it or what to do.
Before we go too far in the conversation, perhaps we should make sure that we're all on the same page in understanding what is IVF and how it works. Dr. Harrison, would you like to give us some insights on what exactly IVF is and how it works?
Sure. IVF, the I stands for in, the V is for vitro, which means glass, and F is fertilization. So that means in vitro fertilization is where the sperm, which comes from the father, meets the egg, which comes from the mother. And fertilization is when the sperm-egg membranes fuse. At that point, you have the beginning of a new human being, a new organism that is not the mother, not the father. It's not a sperm. It's not an egg. It's an embryo. We call a one-celled embryo a zygote. That's a special name for this entity that's only one cell but contains all the information needed to build your body for your whole lifetime. Amazing. That cell, that one cell, divides into 2, which then divides into 4 and forms a body that is composed of multiple cells. And then that embryo continues to develop. And then at some point, in order to complete development, the embryo needs to be placed inside the mom's womb, and that's called embryo transfer. So at that point, usually about 4 or 5 days after fertilization, that's when the mom's womb is able to receive the embryo. So I'm giving just the overall view. Once the embryo is transferred into the mom's womb, and the embryo has to implant, that is, make a solid connection with her womb. And that connection is a place where the mom's womb feeds the baby through its development up until that baby's able to exist and survive outside the mom's womb. Somewhere between 22 weeks and 40 weeks. 40 weeks is much better than 22 weeks. Mm. And then at that point, then they go through the stages of newborn, toddler, child, teenager, adult, old age, until death. So there's one continuous existence from the point of sperm-egg membrane fusion through all the stages of human life until that human being dies.
Talk about some of the process of what the parents would be going through for the IVF process to happen, and whether there's medical risks involved with this for the mother and maybe even the father.
Yes. Well, this gets into kind of an industrial discussion. So there's IVF, which we all think about as the The mom and the dad who want to have children and for some technical reason can't, married, going to the IVF doctor who provides them with a baby. I mean, that's kind of the wonderful picture that we have in our head. The IVF industry is a little darker. The focus of the IVF industry is to produce a baby, okay? Produce a live-born baby at the end of this process. And in order to do that, what the procedure is to retrieve not just one egg or two eggs, but generally multiple eggs. We're talking 11, 20, and to fertilize those eggs, which means you will have, 10 embryos maybe. What are you going to do with 10 embryos? Are you going to implant 10 embryos? No, you're not. So that immediately poses an ethical absurdity. Here you have a mom and dad who want to have a child, and now they have 10 in the dish. What are they going to do? So that forces the question of how many embryos do you put back in the mom's womb, and which embryos do you put back in the mom's womb? So then you enter another level of it's eugenics, which are the best embryos? Well, how do you know? Well, we look at them. Well, how do you know that looking at them tells you what their character is going to be or what kind of a person they're going to develop into? How do you know that that's the best? How do we decide that? It's done by visual grading, which is just absurd. So the doctors look at and choose the best 2, maybe 3 embryos and place those back in the mom's womb. Well, what are you going to do with the other 7? I guess you freeze them. Well, what happens when you freeze these embryos? Some of them die in the freezing process. And what happens later if maybe mom and dad feel like they've completed their family and you still have 7 embryos in the freezer? What are you going to do? I mean, these are the ethical absurdities that are often not discussed with the patients before they get sucked into this wonderful process of, you want a baby, we can give you a baby. But they don't talk about the details. And there's another fairly dark aspect to all this. Embryos, unlike any other part where we're considering a human being, embryos are not considered people. So my organization has participated in amicus briefs in several embryo dispute cases where the mom wants these frozen embryos implanted and the dad wants them destroyed, or vice versa. We have argued that the disposition of the embryos should be like it would be with an adopted child, like it would be with any child, the best interests of the embryo. But the courts have all ruled that IVF embryos are property. And so their disposition is determined according to property and not according to the best interests of the embryo. So that's the dark side that people don't understand before they get sucked into this whole concept of IVF.
Are there medical risks
Oh, thank you.
No. I appreciate the explanation. There certainly are many things to consider with IVF.
Yeah.
Are there in the process for IVF? Are there medical risks associated with that for anyone involved?
Yes, there are medical risks. And some of those medical risks involve causing the woman's ovaries to produce many, many eggs. Our ovaries are designed to produce 1, maybe 2 max eggs per cycle. But when we're talking, retrieval of 10 to 20, you have to add hormones to the woman's body to cause her to what's called superovulate. Well, sometimes that causes the woman's ovaries to form what's called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which can put her life at risk. There's also some question about whether superovulating, causing the woman's eggs to make causing the woman's ovaries to make many, many eggs will have lasting effects on her risk for breast cancer or ovarian cancer. I don't think those questions are answered, but it's a concern because we're causing this organ to act in a way that it's really not supposed to act. And on overriding protections, which provide for just 1 or 2 embryos, 1 or 2 eggs per cycle, and causing the ovaries to act in a way that's just simply not natural. So there are concerns. That's the biggest concern for the mom.
Dr. Stiegemeyer, how do we, as Christians, define what a human being is?
Well, that's at the bottom of this whole thing, isn't it? As Dr. Harrison was saying, we talk about how the courts and others would say that the embryo is not a person and therefore doesn't possess rights, such as the right to life. So underlying it all is just to try to be able to define what this is, right? Because in ethics, you don't know how to treat something or someone until you know what they are. So if this is a product, if this is a mere outcome of technological expertise, if it's just simply fulfillment of a parent's desire, if it's looked at in that very, in an objectified way, then that's one thing. But as Christians, we believe that God has created each individual human life without exception to be in his image and likeness. We can also say that Jesus Christ became a human being and was himself a zygote and went through the same process that every other human being goes through in his mother's womb. So he identifies himself with that level of development of a human being. And then we would even also say that when Jesus died on the cross, he died for every human life, right? This includes all people without exception. So I think we have to just be able to decide, before we know how we can treat an embryo, a human embryo, we have to be clear about what that is. And person is a tricky word. Because courts define it one way, theology defines it a different way, but we can all agree. I think science and courts and theologians can agree that it's a human being. It's an individual human life. And are we going to decide that some human lives have the right to life and other human lives don't? Well, then on what basis? And then that becomes arbitrary. Well, is it desired or not? Well, I might look at an adult and say that I don't desire them to be in my life, right? And so you can't give meaning to a person based on what other people desire from them or what they can produce or what they add or don't add, supposedly, to society. So we have to be very clear that a human being is a thing that is begotten of other human beings and is endowed by the Creator with worth, not because we are somehow morally have merit before God for salvation, but because as creatures, in the way God designed us and the value he imparts upon us, that he does not impart upon angels or beasts, that is, I think those are essential criteria for understanding what a human being is.
If I can jump in here too.
Sure.
What Pastor Stiegemeyer said was, spot on. There's also a very strict scientific criteria for what is an organism, okay? An organism is just the fancy scientific word for a being. An organism is that collection of cells that has self-directed growth, okay? So you can tell an organism from an organ. Your liver does not have self-directed growth. It just acts like a liver. It doesn't act like a being. But an embryo, through all the stages and, all the way up through all of our life, we act like something which is designed for surviving, for living. And even at the very earliest stage, if you wound that embryo by taking out a cell for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, that embryo will heal. So even at the very earliest stages, you've got an embryo that is healing, that has self-directed growth, and is different from the mom or the dad. So I just want to underline what Pastor Stiegemeyer is saying about human beings. There's no question about it. This embryo is a human being from the moment of sperm-egg fusion.
We are discussing questions associated with IVF today with Dr. Donna Harrison, Director of Research for the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, and the Reverend Dr. Scott Stiegemeyer, Associate Professor of Theology and Bioethics at Concordia University Irvine. We'll continue the conversation in just a moment here on The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
At Concordia University Irvine, you have the freedom to explore your future and your faith. Across over 60 on-campus and online programs, you'll experience Christian education that's uniquely designed to develop the whole person, to prepare you not just for your career, but for all of your callings in life. Here you'll explore life's toughest questions, gain lifelong skills, and make relationships that last a lifetime. Concordia University Irvine. Learn more at cui.edu.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
Today we're considering questions associated with IVF, in vitro fertilization, with Dr. Donna Harrison, Director of Research for the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, and the Reverend Dr. Scott Stiegemeyer, Associate Professor of Theology and Bioethics for Concordia University Irvine. Dr. Harrison, I want to go back to some of the stages of IVF that we were talking about earlier, and really pinpoint, where does, in that process, IVF create a human being? At what point is it a human being?
Well, the moment that the sperm membrane fuses with the egg membrane, which takes seconds, by the way, and there's a really cool thing that happens as well. When that happens, there are zinc channels that open, and there's a little flash of light, which I think is just so poetic. But anyway, at the moment when the sperm membrane fuses with the egg membrane, then the sperm no longer exists and the egg no longer exists. What exists is a completely new entity which has self-directed growth and which, has derived from human beings. So it's human and it's a being because it has self-directed growth. That's where a human being starts.
So, Dr. Stiegemeyer, what are some of these moral and ethical complications surrounding IVF based on everything that we've been talking about and the things that Dr. Harrison has described and talking about what we believe a human being to be? What are those moral and ethical complications?
It really can come down to the golden rule. How do we want to be treated? How would we like to be regarded by other people? And so if we are, and I think we must define an embryo as not only a human life, it is a distinct, unique human being with its own genetic complement and so on, but also one endowed by the Creator with identity, right? And has been died for. So if we believe those things, we accept those things, then it is simply a matter of treating that other person as we would wish to be treated. So I think just kind of as an underlying moral statement, that the golden rule gets a lot of traction in many, many applications. It's also really simply Martin Luther's explanation of the fifth commandment, thou shalt not murder, that we should defend the physical life of our neighbor. And as Dr. Harrison mentioned a minute ago, when you produce all these, so-called surplus embryos, or these embryos that you're not going to be able to transfer, as she mentioned, many of these would be frozen, which can be, I think Pope John Paul II or someone said that that's an absurd concept of freezing human beings for possible later use. And many of them die in that process or are damaged in that process. And just the very, oddness of we're freezing human beings cryogenically. But then many of them get destroyed either through the freezing process, or they're just simply discarded, or they're given over for research purposes, which destroys them. So it is cheapening human life. It is basing the value of a baby, right, or a child upon the desires and will of the parents instead of as a gift. Right? We should see children as gifts from God, not merely products that we choose, and we get to determine whether we want it to be a boy or a girl using the kind of genetic analysis that Dr. Harrison was mentioning while it's before it's transferred. So it cheapens human life. It is a violation of the golden rule and the fifth commandment. It is results in the senseless deaths of countless human beings. And really, I think when you add those things together, I would even add that there's a distortion on our understanding of marriage, as far as that goes too, because the idea of God joining the man and because that's what Jesus says, what God has joined together, right? So if God is joining together a man and a woman, ordinarily that is fruitful. Ordinarily that love produces fruit. That marital union, that sexual union, which is given in marriage, ordinarily produces children. And so to kind of interfere with that, what we might say the sexual union with the procreative nature of that sexual union, and that can be done using birth control. It can be, ways that we're trying to control the procreative thing and separate it from the uniting physically in sexual intercourse. By dividing those things, I think we're going contrary to the Creator's intention. What God has joined together, not just the man and the woman, but the procreative and the unitive, loving embrace in marriage. It's an overused term, but in terms of playing God. But I don't mean that in terms of just, we're using technology to do things we couldn't do before. But it is a way, I think, of understanding marriage and children that is distorted or divorced from the Creator's intention.
Boy, can I spring off of what Pastor Stiegemeyer just said, because brilliant. This brings up another issue with IVF. There is no requirement in IVF that the person who provides sperm and the person who provides eggs and the person in whose womb this embryo grows will be the parents. There's no requirement at all. What you've done is you've completely chopped up each of the things that, as Pastor Stiegemeyer said, was originally put together as a very integral and important design, father, mother, loving embrace, children. Now it can be any sperm donor who may not know anything about this child, can be any egg donor who may not know anything about this child. It can be a gestational carrier, which is what they call the womb that they implant. And the parents can be any combination of any number of people legally, because it's a legal contract. So this is such a perversion of what we think. And I think it's important that when we talk about this IVF issue, to understand we have a compassionate picture in our head, but that compassionate picture doesn't match the industry. The industry is out for money and to produce product. And that's very different than the compassion. Now, I'm not saying it can't be applied in a compassionate way, but in general, the motive for the industry is profit. And that's producing a baby no matter how many other embryos are destroyed in the process.
Dr. Harrison, are there alternatives to IVF that have been useful and helpful for husband and wife who are wanting to grow a family?
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's going to reveal how old I actually am, because I was actually trained in OB-GYN prior to the huge push for people to go into IVF. So basic good medicine is you make a diagnosis and you treat the underlying problem. Infertility in and of itself is not necessarily a disease. Thyroid disease, problems with the pituitary, there are diabetes, any number of things that can lead to infertility as a symptom of the disease. But good medicine says you treat the underlying disease. That concept has been resurrected, thankfully, and it's called restorative reproductive medicine. So doctors who practice restorative reproductive medicine, shocker, actually try to figure out what's causing the infertility and to treat the underlying cause of the infertility. And there are some studies which show that method of treating the underlying cause of infertility actually has better results or as good of results, depending on the cause, as IVF. So go with what makes sense. Find the cause of the infertility and treat that cause, and then let God's design take over.
Dr. Stiegemeyer, we've talked a lot about IVF and how this is something that couples use when they're facing infertility. And Dr. Harrison just gave a wonderful alternative to this. But couples who face infertility, it's very difficult. How do we care for our neighbors who are facing this issue, who wish for children but have not been given this gift? Where is the gospel in this conversation today?
Oh, such a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think one thing we have to consider, especially people that have children, may not always be quite sensitive and aware as to the difficulty or the pain and even suffering and sense of grief that parents or married couples or who would like to have children, because we have to remember to desire children for a married man and woman, to desire to have children is a godly thing, right? It is, God says, be fruitful and multiply. It is part of the design for marriage. So that desire is a God-pleasing desire. And so when one, because of medical reasons, is not able to do that, that can cause a great sense of loss and a great sense of grief that the couple may do a very good job of hiding. And so being aware that, without probing in people's personal lives, but just to be aware that sometimes our neighbors who may desire children, that can cause a great deal of suffering for them, and not to be glib about it. And not simply to just kind of say, well, pray about it. And of course we should pray, but first of all, look, I can't offer advice, but I can stand with you. I can accompany you in this sadness. So I think that's part of it. A big part of it is recognizing the pain that this can cause. Of course, pray for our neighbor, if by name or just in general, that we know there are people that would love to have, and that would be good parents, that are not able to experience that. So to pray for our neighbor, to be loving about that and sensitive in terms of how we speak about it. I think as a pastor, I think Mother's Day as a church celebration can be a complicated event. I'm all in favor of lauding family and marriage and motherhood and fatherhood. That's like I said, godly. But Mother's Day, and probably also Father's Day, can be a little complicated for people in the congregation who maybe would desire that, but are not able to have that. I think just as pastors, we should be aware that this is not necessarily, the word motherhood is not necessarily, it can create emotions in people that, again, we may not just realize that that's going on. So just an awareness of that, I think, is just really huge. But also, people desire community. And a lot of times, that is the basic human community that God created in Eden was the family. But there's other definitions to the word family, by which I don't mean redefining marriage, but I mean other definitions, including your congregational family, your Christian family, in your extended family, that we can provide community for our neighbor, and in that sense, help them to feel like they belong to the greater family. And so I think those are a couple of things. Awareness, be careful how we speak about some of these things in the church because of people's pain, but also just to foster in our churches greater sense of community and fellowship. So because God puts the lonely in families, God desires for us to be, we're hardwired for human connection. God says it's not good or complete for the man to be alone. But the man wasn't alone. He was in the presence of God, which is the ultimate companion. But in some sense, Adam's purpose and design as a man was not yet fulfilled on his own. Was the one thing he couldn't do on his own, and that is have a family. And so we know that this is part of how we're designed. But I think if we, as a church, heighten our emphasis on developing a tight-knit or close-knit congregational life, can sort of satisfy some of that deep hunger or desire or need, actually.
This has been a great conversation. We will put the links in the show notes to both of those Lutheran Witness articles that both of you have authored. And also, since we're talking about infertility today, we'll throw the link in for our recent Lutheran Ladies Lounge episode on infertility as well in the show notes for the episode. Dr. Donna Harrison, Director of Research for the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And the Reverend Dr. Scott Stiegemeyer, Associate Professor of Theology and Bioethics at Concordia University Irvine. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Golseth.
I'm Andy Bates.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit kfuo.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@kfuo.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.